stipulations we put in this is that, this would be for bills that have sort of substantive changes in law that have to do with juvenile justice or corrections or basically changing like a charge and statute. And then the other part of it is at the discretion of a chairperson or at the request of a senator, coming to the executive board. So we imagine this would be a decent number of bills, but obviously not all bills. It's not all 600 plus bills that we would do. But we know how many bills usually come to judiciary. And so it's sort of a little hard to envision how much it would cost. But LRO, I have a lot of trust in LRO that they would be able to assess their capacity. If we would need to hire an additional FTE to then provide the resources to then enact this, they would tell us, or if they would have to potentially contract out services for expertise on this. That's sort of written in here. LRO would do this and find the resources they need. So I anticipate there's going to be a cost. I do. Unless RL tells me that they can do this in-house, which is possible as well. But.
Would you have any idea how much time it would take per bill?
So in the report, it details out a little bit more on the process, but at really high level, I mean, the Creighton data center, they were taking hours on these. It wasn't like days on end. So they really tried to say, with the limited time that we have, basically like a 4 to 6 hours, can we put together a 2-page report? And that's what they were able to put together.
Okay, thank you.
Additional questions, Senator McCollister.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Hughes. Would you presume that when it came time to pass the budget, it would come with a impact statement?
Presume? No. Our budget is a moral document, and there's a lot in there. There's also a lot in there that really doesn't touch upon, I think, directly some of these, inequities we're talking about. So really trying to confine it to subject matter where we're seeing the data that there's an overrepresentation of people of color in these different systems. It's worthwhile for us to sort of target it, but it's a good question.
Thank you.
Additional questions, Senator Lathrop.
I do have a question, and I apologize that when this was in the Rules Committee, I didn't make the hearing. So I do want to, a lot of these I would expect would be, for example, on a bill enhancing a criminal penalty, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And as you noted, there's a disproportionate number of brown and black people caught up in the criminal justice system. So if we were to, for example, raise the penalty for, or have a bill to raise the penalty for armed robbery, the racial impact statement would necessarily reflect what's already the case, right? In other words, this is going to disproportionately affect, because brown and black people are arrested more often and prosecuted more often for that. I'm wondering what we're trying to get out of it, because in contrast to changing an existing penalty, which is being disproportionately enforced, or brown and black people are being disproportionately represented among those arrested and prosecuted, then you have the situation where Congress had a difference between the penalty for cocaine versus whatever the other drug was that was more commonly used by minority communities. What are we looking for? Those cases where we're doing something that makes it worse for brown and black communities than it makes for whites, or just illustrates that they are disproportionately affected every time we make a penalty worse. Does that make sense?
It does, and my answer is not going to be as clear as I think you're looking for. Sometimes, even what you just said, that there's disproportionate, let's say if we change some charge to make it harsher, let's say for robbery, not everybody, I don't think in our body would say that this is going to disproportionately impact people of color. I think data might suggest that, but I think that might be sort of up to debate. I think when we have tools that very clearly tell us what data has shown us, it now leads us to focus more on the solution. So in that instance, it might just tell us what we already assume, what you're assuming and what I'm assuming, which is it's going to have a disproportionate impact on Black and brown communities. But instead of debating whether or not that's true, we can just move forward and figure out what the policy solution is. In some of these other nuanced, places, like you mentioned, drugs, right? And some have a more harmful. I think it's going to be even more helpful to dig into the data there, because we're going to see that there are inequities that exist by the certain drugs that we have that are being utilized by different communities, and it'll make us make different decisions. That's going to be even more helpful, I would say. Really want to get past the standard where we're still debating the data, and instead utilize the data for what it is and move forward on the policy. So that's really the hope. It's more seen as a tool and less as left up to question on whether or not it's real.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? I guess I've got a couple. So you envision this racial impact statement mostly geared toward the criminal justice system? And would it be also any other area that the legislature works out, or are you primarily focused there first?
I'm primarily focused there because that's what we've seen in other states that's worked. It also lends itself to the most publicly available data. There was always a conversation in other states, municipalities on, well, does a racial impact affected in education? And I think you could make the case yes, but for the purposes of where we're seeing the most discrepancies, the justice system or correction system seemed to be the most appropriate place to really focus their efforts on.
Okay, so in the opening or something I saw where you had referenced where there's a disproportionate amount of people of color in our prison system versus the percentage of the population, it struck me, and I think it was Senator Lathrop said the other day, but I don't remember who for sure, that 70 to 80% of our prison population had a parent that has been in prison. Did anybody else hear that or remember who said that? Anyway, it really struck me that a very high percentage of the population, that is their culture, that's what they learned, that's what they saw their parents do, and we generally try to emulate our parents because they are our role models, good or bad. So I guess my question to you is, do you just use strictly population numbers, or do you take into account any type of that culture where you have multiple generations of individuals doing the same way? And this cuts across ethnic boundaries. It's not a black or white or brown issue. I would assume you would find the same possibility of prisoners who have a parent or parents or even aunts or uncles who were in the prison system. Have you ever thought about that as being a factor in trying to determine, what the racial impact would be of any specific legislation?
So I'll try to react to a couple of questions. So first, I think words really matter here, and I know what the question you're asking is. I just want to try to address one thing. Data is really helpful, and you're bringing up at least data points that you might have heard from Senator Lathrop, which I think is important, which is the percent of individuals in our correction system that have had a individual, a parent that has been in the correction system. That's helpful. In these racial impact statements, you would never see a reference to culture because that's a very broad term, and also what's most important is where are we seeing the disparity? So you'll probably see ethnicity and race or socioeconomic status, but ethnicity and race for the purpose of this. Because I also don't want anybody to think that we're talking about culture in a broad sense. But the question you're asking is an important question. I introduced a bill last year that was a caregiver diversion bill. Senator Lathrop remembers this. It's creating caregiver diversion program. Basically, we would create a diversion program at a local level or provide the opportunity to do this where if there was a individual that was the sole head of the household, and is there a way that we can provide some sort of diversion instead of putting them in the system? Because if there's one parent, only one parent or a main parent that's in the system, it's going to have a negative effect on the family. In a racial impact statement for that bill, I imagine we're going to maybe see that data point you just brought up, which is the percent of individuals that have family members, parents in the system. The question you're asking is the exact question we would be posed with if we had a racial impact statement. But when we don't have it, we kind of live in this conversation. So the racial impact statement would diagnose, give us data on racial disparities we might see with parents in the system, broken down by race and ethnicity. It might tell us if there was a similar bill to the one I just shared in another state that was passed, and analyze any data we have on the impact of that bill. It will do the best that we can to get to the answer to answer your question, but it won't tell you whether or not the bill is the thing that you should do or shouldn't do. So you're posing the right question. It's a policy question, but
So if I could follow up, so the intent of this racial impact statement would be another minority protection? I mean, is that a pretty broad sweep, or that's not?
I would say that's a broad sweep, but not a minority protection. An analysis of the impact a legislative proposal would or wouldn't have on a racial or ethnic subgroup. And that information is important for us to take into account when we're making public policy decisions. Actually, it's critical. May not change what we do, but I think it actually will change in the end how informed we are in the decisions we make. So that's what it'll be, not a protection, because we still get to do, as individual policymakers, whatever we may get to do. Just like a fiscal note. We get a fiscal note. We still utilize that as a piece of information. It doesn't stop us or impede us from what we do from there on in. It's a point of information that we take to help us make public policy decisions.
So I guess your point is not to point out a minority impact to create more of a sympathy vote or more of a leaning toward the issue, or the flip side of that, of course, is if it benefits a majority to try and sway the other way, that we shouldn't enact that legislation because it does create a positive impact on a majority of the state population. Is that kind of where you're going, or?
No.
Okay.
This is not the intent to then provide a sympathy vote. My hope is we don't do that. We make informed public policy decisions. When we have the best available data possible, we make better decisions. And so this would be the best public available data on how a change legislative proposal would or would not impact subgroups that are traditionally overrepresented in certain systems. It also helps to avoid biases in some way, shape, or form. So that's why the data is really, really important. And individuals can make whatever decisions they want after that.
Okay, very good. Any additional questions? Seeing none, you'll stay for closing?
Yeah.
Very good. We will open up LB 657 to proponents.
Good afternoon, Chairman Hughes and members of the Executive Board Committee. My name is Craig Beck, that's C-R-A-I-G-B-E-C-K, and I'm the Fiscal Analyst at Open Sky Policy Institute, here to testify in support of LB 657 because we believe it is important to consider the racial impact of proposed legislation. The manner in which state and local governments raise and spend revenue has major implications for racial and ethnic equity, and fiscal policy has too often increased racial disparities in power and wealth. Working to ensure fiscal policies provide equal opportunity for all people helps to promote prosperity. Fiscal policies do not need to be explicitly race-based to worsen or perpetuate inequities. Some legislation, such as large tax cuts for the wealthy, exacerbates disparities without acknowledging their impact on certain groups. Tax cuts in North Carolina in 2013, for example, resulted in white North Carolinians receiving 81% of the benefits despite being only 2/3 of the state's population. Similarly, according to an October 2018 report by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed by Congress in 2017 overwhelmingly benefited wealthy Americans. Because white Americans are 3 times more likely to be among the nation's wealthy, the TCJA resulted in households of color being largely excluded from accessing its benefits. Considering these examples, we believe it is vital to thoroughly examine the racial impact of proposed legislation to ensure that no negative effects are imposed upon communities of color. We have identified several policy areas where the introduction of racial impact statements for proposed legislation could be especially insightful. Changes in the tax code, particularly those which disproportionately impact one end of the socioeconomic spectrum, often serve to increase or temper racial disparities. The state inheritance tax and earned income tax credit program are 2 examples of policies that, when changed, have an outsized effect on particular racial or ethnic groups. It is also important to examine how changes in certain budget areas would exacerbate racial inequities within the state. Health, education, and transportation funding in particular is vital for shared prosperity. Other states have found that communities of color are more likely to be uninsured, live in counties with less access to high-quality clinical care, attend school in aging school buildings, and are less likely to own a car. State funding is vital in seeking to mitigate these disparities, which begins with understanding the potential racial impact of proposed legislation. There are several resources that examine racial disparities, which we believe could aid in the development of racial impact statements for proposed legislation. The U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey tracks SNAP and school enrollment by racial and ethnic groups, as well as income and poverty status of families. The Kids Count Data Center disaggregates children at Title I schools by race and ethnicity at the state level, with statistics on graduation, proficiency, suspension, and expulsion metrics. There is a growing trend of incorporating racial disparities in data collection, and rendering a thorough analysis of the racial impact of proposed legislation is increasingly feasible. Open Sky is currently working to incorporate this racial equity framework in updates of our past publications as well as future analyses. We strongly believe in doing everything possible to evaluate the racial impact of proposed legislation and urge the committee to advance LB 657. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beck. Are there questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am Karen Beldancy, KarenBelldancy, and I am the Executive Director of the YWCA of Lincoln. First, I would like to thank Senator Vargas and co-sponsors for introducing LB 657. LB 657 requires that racial impact statements be created for every bill introduced in the unicameral. At the YWCA, we are committed to the work of racial justice until institutions are transformed, until the world sees women, girls, and people of color the way we do, equal, powerful, and unstoppable. Too often, racial justice is forgotten when drafting laws and public policy, as reflected in the frequent racial profiling incidents and increased policing of people of color, which has led to the overcriminalization and even death of people of color. LB 657 represents a critical first step in recognizing systemic racism. While this legislation by itself won't dismantle systemic racism, it will require that legislators be more intentional about the legislation they vote for before moving forward and ensure that our state resources are used effectively to help all Nebraskans. With LB 657, the legislative body cannot ignore the racial disparities that accompany a bill. Too many times, people of color have to bring forth evidence of racial disparities for senators to actively engage or understand the impact of their legislation and what it has on our community. Something that should always be considered when introducing legislation. Nebraska would not be alone in passing this legislation. As the Sentencing Project reports, there are currently 7 states that already have adopted racial impact statements, and an additional 10 states have bills currently pending in their legislatures, all seeking to achieve a more comprehensive approach to legislation that contributes to healthy, diverse, strong, and safe communities. We hope that with this legislation, legislators specifically examine racial disparities to advance racial justice solutions, but also work toward impacting communities and incorporate and include us to achieve racial equity. And for those reasons, I urge you to advance LB 657 to general file. Thank you, and if you have any questions, I will attempt to respond.
Thank you, Ms. Bell-Bency. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for coming in today.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the Executive Board. My name is Spike Eicholt, S-P-I-K-E-E-I-C-K-H-O-L-T, appearing on behalf of the ACLU of Nebraska in support of LB 657. We want to thank Senator Vargas for introducing this bill. The bill, as proposed, would direct the Executive Board to have the Legislative Research Office create racial impact statements for designated legislation. But I think, as Senator Vargas explained, I think the area of focus and what his rule change proposed earlier this year was to have racial impact statements for areas of law in which we already know we have a disproportionate racial impact, and that's primarily criminal justice and juvenile justice. Those are on the Judiciary Committee. No, because I've made this point before. We can measure, we can look at the people who are impacted by the criminal justice system and see a clear trend of disproportionate racial impact. We see it every year, and I think in March or April, the Crime Commission is going to have their racial profiling data that they compile annually. We can show that there is a disproportionate number of people who are stopped in traffic stops, who are cited, and who are arrested. You can look at the jail populations any day of the year, in the prison populations as well, and you can see that the people who end up in jail and prison are disproportionately people of color. People of color are overrepresented. There is something with our criminal code or something with the way that we enforce that causes that. It may not be explicit, may not be deliberate, but it's systematic. If you do nothing, it's going to continue. What this would provide for would be a way for the legislature to at least anticipate what a bill or a proposal would do. Is it going to exacerbate that system that we have now, or is it going to mitigate it? In response to what Senator Lathrop asked earlier, there are some instances a bill that might just increase a penalty, and you can look at the number of people who are in prison serving a sentence for that penalty, and that's easy to measure, it's easy to anticipate. There are other things, though, that are a little more subtle with how we define crimes, the sanction that we have for existing crimes, what crimes we don't penalize that much, what ones we do. And I can think of an example. Someone wants to ask me of one where I think if we had a racial impact statement, we could measure a mitigation effect on people of color. This is a good bill. It was a proposed rule change earlier this year, and I think in response to what Speaker Hilgers asked about at that time, and I was listening, that what this bill would actually do, and the reason why I think a bill would be necessary is that the bill on pages 3, lines 11 through 15 would direct that other state agencies or other departments would cooperate with the legislature. And I think if that was passed into law, that would at least be clear legislative authority, directive, or at least reflective of legislative intent that those other agencies cooperate and work with the legislature. That's maybe more substantive than just a rule change. So even if you were to pass this bill, the bill envisions that the executive board would still have to take it the further step, either on a bill-by-bill basis or at the request of the introducer of a bill or the request of the chair, or however the executive board and the rules committee wants to craft that proposal. But I think doing this is an important step to address the disparity that we have in our criminal justice system. And this is particularly important if we're going to look at systemic reform of our criminal justice system in the coming years. So I don't have anything else to add. Or maybe since I'm not used to having 5 minutes, I'm used to having 3. No offense.
That's hardly offensive to me.
When you look at the racial profiling data, a common crime that people are stopped with are driving under suspension. That's not court ordered not to drive. It's your license is suspended because you got behind on child support or you've not paid a traffic fine and court costs, and your license is suspended until you fix that suspension. That's a fairly significant crime. It's a jailable offense and it's an arrestable offense. Senator Matt Hansen passed a bill through judiciary that went into effect last July that would lengthen the amount of time that the court, if you don't pay a traffic fine on time or you don't go to court for that, the court would contact the DMV and your license is suspended until you resolve that. Senator Matt Hansen passed a bill, LB 259, that increased the amount of time from 20 days to 30 days where the court would notify the DMV and give a person an opportunity to go back to court to kind of halt that process, to either ask for more time to pay that fine or do community service or something in the alternative. It was a good bill. This legislature adopted that. That was a good reform. It would have been nice to see how that would work if that would mitigate racial impact. I suspect it would that it would do that and it's going to have an impact. But I don't know, and we don't know. It's just speculation. It's just anecdote. It's an argument. And if you imagine passing legislation without fiscal notes and you're trying to somehow argue what this is going to cost, and I think it's going to cost less, and I think it's going to cost more, that's not very informed. This would provide to have that in the racial impact statement setting.
Thank you, Mr. Eichholt. Are there questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Any additional proponents to LB 657? Anyone wishing to testify as an opponent to LB 657? Anyone wishing to testify in the neutral capacity on LB 657? Seeing none, Senator Vargas, you're welcome to close. We do have written testimony in lieu of personal from a proponent from Julie Erickson, Voices of Children, Katie Pitts, Nebraska Appleseed, Maggie Ballard, Heartland Family Services, Sean Kelly, Douglas County Commissioners, Katie Zolkowski, Nebraska County Attorneys Association. We also have position letters in support from Rick Vest, Lincoln County Board of Commissioners, Sharita Strong for herself, Amy Wenzel herself, Curtis Bryant, National Association of Social Workers, Amy Benke, Healthcare Association of Nebraska, and a position letter in opposition from Doug Kagan, Nebraska Taxpayers for Freedom. With that, Senator Vargas.
I try my best to be as pragmatic as possible when we're talking about this bill. It is a tool. It is difficult to describe how it feels when being one of the few people of color in this body, seeing the disproportionate makeup of people of color in our justice system. I visited NSP, I visited Tecumseh, I visited, and seeing that disproportionate level of overrepresentation of black and brown people is difficult for me to see. It's also difficult to see it in the justice system at large as well. We did a report, the Legislative Planning Committee did a report, and the report showed that we see the overrepresentation in our juvenile justice system and our justice system. I don't think that's left up for debate. However, as lawmakers, as policymakers, there's a benefit for us analyzing the impact that a legislation will have on a subgroup that is overrepresented in these systems. Similar to what Spike said, it's not the solution. Solution is what we're going to decide, whether or not we think that there needs to be reform at these levels. That is up to us. But the extent to which something is going to be harmful or helpful or do nothing at all to Black and brown communities is the decision we make with every one of our bills. And specifically, I would say, in the bills and the subject matter in the justice system. Sometimes it is difficult talking about it because it's from a very unique perspective I bring this. And instead of focusing on my qualitative experience and all the instances of racism I felt in my own life, let's focus on what data is really telling us about this overrepresentation. And maybe it will inform us enough to not wait till after we pass legislation and it's too late to change and reform the system. That's what this is about. And when you have it in front of you, you can choose to be more informed and educated about how this bill may impact Black and brown communities, or you cannot. With all due respect, I don't think that this is about sympathy. It is about reality. And we should be as informed as possible about how communities of color are impacted by the laws we make here. So with that, I'm happy to answer any additional questions.
Thank you, Senator Vargas. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, that will close our hearing on LB 657, and we do have a reference